Ladies and gentlemen, could I ask you to take your seats, please? We had a little delay because the Premier was running slightly behind time, but I'm unreliably informed that he is here now, so I'm just waiting for the wave or the appropriate cough, and then I will introduce him. And I'm told that the Premier is happy to take questions, time allowing. So if you haven't thought of a question yet and you've got something bubbling away, today might be your day. And if we do get to questions, let me just fill and stretch a bit more. If we do get to questions, if you wouldn't mind if I can point you, or the Premier will point you, if you could actually identify yourself before you launch into your question, that would be wonderful. Right, so who do we think is going to win the premiership? Oh God, I hope not. No, Collingwood. God, you want to be the Cats, I'm hoping. Otherwise we'll have to have you discommunicated. All right, we're waiting. Oh, come on, Nada. So, how's it all going so far? Good, pleased to hear it. And I was going to tell a joke, but I don't have any that's appropriate, so I'm really sorry. Yeah, no. Okay. No, waiting. So you'll all be primed, I can tell. And of course, coming up after the Premier, we have our fabulous keynote speaker, who I've just met, who's out the back. And then we'll have the panel and water discussion. Then after that, we'll have lunch, you'll have a cup of tea, some more speakers, we'll have another panel. Yeah, I've got nothing, sorry. Okay. Maybe I should go off the stage and make another grand entrance. Yeah, that might work. And with bated breath. Yes? Okay. I'm back on officially. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back everyone. As I said, as our proceedings continue today, we do have a jam-packed day. It's my great pleasure now to introduce the Premier, who will be talking about the government's agenda for the region. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome the Honourable Daniel Andrews MP, the Premier of Victoria. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome the Victorian Premier, Mr. Daniel Andrews.
Well, that's very kind of you, such a grand entrance. I was just doing a little side meeting about a very exciting project. They collared me on the way in, so Thank you so much. Can I begin my remarks today by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land and pay my deep personal respects to elders past and present. And I make that acknowledgement with a real sense of pride, not just as the Premier of Victoria, but as a proud Victorian, knowing that we have taken the most profound, the most significant steps towards a treaty with Aboriginal Victorians, the biggest steps of any jurisdiction in our nation. The fact that others have not taken those steps diminishes all of us, but it also singles us out as the leader in our nation and our state. This region is always at its best when it's leading from the front. I want to pay a special mention, and I'm sorry to have missed her presentation, but Jill Gallagher as the Treaty Advancement Commissioner is a good friend, someone I respect deeply, someone who is simply perfect for this role. Truth to power is something that Jill knows very well and has practiced for a long time. She taught me a long time ago when I was the Minister for Health, and she was the CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Controlled Health Organisation, VACCHO, that better outcomes for Aboriginal Victorians could only come from Aboriginal Victorians, and self-determination was absolutely about giving Indigenous Victorians control over their destiny, their decision-making, that sense of justice and fairness. So I'm sorry to have missed her comments, but I'm sure she's given you a good sense of where treaty is up to, the complexities and challenges of that process, but the inherent worth of us pursuing this and getting this right. Some things are about the start, others are much more about where you finish. This journey will take time, but it will make us a better, fairer, a more just, and I think a more prosperous state. And hopefully we can do what we do best, and that is lead from the front. Now, there are many other acknowledgements that I should make, and I'll go through those. And then, of course, my officer very helpfully prepared a very long speech, which I think I'll not necessarily use, because I might make a few points and then leave as much time as I can for questions and comments at the end. I do want to acknowledge ministerial and parliamentary colleagues, and our numbers have expanded in recent times, and I'm very pleased and very proud about that. But to Lisa and Gail, to Darren, to Christine, now I think Andy Medic is here as well, who is... I want to make a comment. I want to make a comment. Andy and I don't necessarily agree on everything, but one thing is certain: if you want to spend 10 minutes learning about the power of a well-argued case, if you want to spend 10 minutes learning and reaffirming the power of parliamentary debate, the power of authenticity, then go online and have a look at the speech that Andy gave in the Legislative Council this week about some very important reform that passed the Parliament, and it passed in no small measure due to the eloquent, brave and courageous way in which he made his case and explained why he would be supporting that important bill. It's not often that I would single out a member of the crossbench, but it is a truly special presentation, and one that I know, and I'm told, the mysteries of the upper house are not well understood by me, but I am told that it changed minds in the running of the debate. People were going to vote one way and listen to his speech and decided to, in my judgment, do the right thing and vote for a more equal, a more inclusive Victoria. Now, Elaine Carbines is here, of course. One of her duties is to bring me to golf courses where I'm not allowed to play golf, which is a wonderful thing. I don't hold it against her, it's fine. Elaine is a force and someone that I respect and someone we've always worked very closely with in lots of different ways, but in more recent times, her leadership at G21 is very important to me and very important to our team. This dialogue and this important discussion, bringing together, in a true regional sense, a long-term plan is very important to me. So I thank you, Elaine, for that dialogue. And it's a very frank exchange. Again, there's not always agreement on every issue, but I think we're a better government for the fact that we engage so closely with G21 and its members. To Bill Mithen, to representatives of each of the councils, Surf Coast, Colac Otway, Golden Plains, Queenscliff, and of course the city of Greater Geelong, where I'll be heading after this. So I'll refer to my notes just for the next bit, and then I won't go off script, but I'll give you just some more informal thoughts. I'm heading off after we finish here today to the Geelong Arts Centre, and as you would know, or GPAC as it was known, as you would all know, we funded stage 2, just under $40 million. It was an election commitment back in 2014. That's finished. We're now into the third and final stage, well over $100 million of investment. And it is an investment. It's a conscious choice to give Geelong and the region the sort of infrastructure that attracts visitors, that secures employment, and that underpins the prosperity and the sense of energy, if you like, the real spark in a region. Big events need significant and purpose-built, whether it's stadia. Obviously, the fifth and final stage at Caninian Park is another point of pride for us, but I'm not heading there today. I'm going to the Performing Arts Centre, where we'll have some exciting announcements about Back to Back, a theatre company that I think is well known by so many in the room. It's a fantastic example of the sort of Victoria that we want to build, and it's not by mistake. It's no error that it's in this region, and it's been promoted and supported and nurtured, and everybody involved in that project. They have toured, they have given mesmerising performances from Newtown to New York, and that's something that everyone in this community should be very proud of, and we've got some exciting announcements to make when we meet many from Back to Back in just a little while. Now, my speech has a long list of things that I should go through. They're all a little bit braggy, all the wonderful things that we've done for you. I don't necessarily want to do that. I do want to make a couple of comments though. There's a real sense of energy, a real sense of momentum in this local community, and indeed right across regional Victoria. We have the lowest unemployment rate since records were kept, and they've been keeping those records for quite some time. Now, that's not to say that we should give up the search for further employment opportunities, further economic development opportunities. Of course, we will never do that. I think we would have, well, I'm certain that we've demonstrated to you and the communities that you represent, the sectors that you come from, this local region particularly, that we won't waste a day in office. We regard it as a great gift, a very, very special gift. And it's for us and all the people that we work with to make a difference every day, to make the state fairer and stronger. And as you know, I grew up in regional Victoria, and I know and understand very well that our state will never prosper if regional Victoria is not in a strong, well-supported position. And whilst there is a real sense of energy, a sense of achievement, a sense of momentum in this part of regional Victoria, we should spare a thought today. There are many that are doing it very tough. Record low rainfall, some that are on the cusp of a second failed season. It's very patchy as well. There's a deep frustration that comes from the fact that some, particularly in our grains industry, are reporting what they think will be a very good season. Others are in desperate circumstances if the season unfolds as they think that it will. That patchiness is a real challenge and makes it even harder. But the sense of momentum, cast your mind back. Our COA announces they're going, Ford announces they're going, a number of other very challenging decisions for this region, not just for Geelong, but for the region in a broader sense. Think of how far we've come in the years since then. And that has not been by accident. It's been through a true partnership between local government and our government. The federal government has played a part there too from time to time. It's not for a moment to rest or to settle or to be boastful, but it is a point of pride, I think, for everybody here today and so many more, that we've been able to deal with challenges, the scale of which, the significance of which would have, well, a community that wasn't as strong, partnerships that weren't as enduring, perhaps things would have been very, very different. Now, I know that there is still work to do around those issues of economic transition and supporting those who are moving from one industry to another, and we'll always be focused on that, and we think that, and we know that skills is very important. The recent upgrades at Gordon around the hospitality, the sort of facilities around teaching those courses, together with record support for TAFE and training across the state, most notably free TAFE, with enrolments that are 100% higher today than they were this time last year before free TAFE was put in, is just one example. Listening to industry, listening to our partners, and making sure that we don't take resources away. We're not cutting the things that matter. We're in fact diversifying and further investing to make sure that every Victorian, particularly those in regional Victoria, where those cuts to TAFE hurt the most, can get the skills they need for the job they want. That's the constant message that I hear, and it's very, very important. That's just one example of the fact that we will stay the course when it comes to those issues of economic transition. Now, there are many other examples of different things we're doing, and I'll go through a couple of them, and they're linked together not so much I don't use them to do a great long endorsement of the government. What I would say is that they are linked together by the fact that they've all come from listening to this local region and developing a positive and optimistic plan for this region for the 2014 election, throughout that term in office, given that we did much more than we had committed to do. We added to our election commitments in the running, if you like, and then, of course, the platform that we took to the election for the entire region last year. Roads, rail, hospitals and schools are real defining features of our government and defining features of good state government, I think. When you think about the Warn Ponds duplication, very substantial progress being made there. The impacts that will have getting rid of what is a very dangerous level crossing north of the Marshall Station, but also making sure that we've got transport infrastructure that's fit to cope with the growth that this region is dealing with. That presents some challenges, but it also presents significant opportunities as well. More broadly, the planning work and an investment of over $100 million around that critical issue of properly separating the regional rail lines, I should say, Geelong as well as the Ballarat line as well, from very busy outer suburban metro rail system. So building two systems rather than one, where there's infrastructure that's shared and capacity always limited. Beyond that, significant investments. We want the Geelong Hospital, we want the Torquay Community Hospital, we want every hospital across this region and across our state to have the support and the certainty that they need in order to provide the best services to residents. We've made so much progress in these last 4.5 years, more than a 40% increase in the funding we provide to our dedicated nurses and doctors, our AMBOs. We see the best ambulance response times that our state has ever seen. And not 1 month, not 1 quarter, but a sustained improvement because of significant investment that we've been pleased to make. Again, listening to communities and understanding what's truly important. Yes, the Geelong Hospital needs to be improved further. We stepped in after the private hospital decided that they would no longer operate. We think we can turn a problem into something that's altogether better than what was there previously. We can help cater for the growth, particularly around maternity services and providing the best healthcare for our smallest Victorians through the commitments we've made and the fact we've wasted no time getting on with them. But we've also listened to communities like Torquay, where there are many things that can be achieved, many services that can be provided at a very local level. They don't need to be at a big tertiary hospital. And that's where planning and development of those 10 community hospitals, one of which will be right here, that's where that came from. Listening to local communities, hearing and understanding the things that were important to them. In terms of schools, we've got planning for 2 brand new schools in this region, 7 others are being upgraded. I have spent a lot of time in the last 4.5 years with our fantastic team down here visiting many different schools to celebrate upgrades and improvements. That's what the education state is all about. It makes such a big difference to educational outcomes, to pride, to a sense of purpose. It's a great way of thanking our teachers and staff and engaged parent community, but it's also a really good way of creating jobs. There are 1,400 of these school upgrade projects going on right across the state. They're good for many thousands of jobs across Victoria and often for smaller firms that need that pipeline of work at that level. Big billion-dollar transport projects are important too, but not necessarily for those smaller local firms. So education upgrades, hospital upgrades, some of these smaller projects, they make a very big difference, not just for the end user, but for those who provide those services and do that work. Now, I want to just say a couple of things about the Geelong City deal. And I've not come here today to make political points, and I must say that we are in a much better position with the federal government than we've perhaps been for a long time. I've had an opportunity in recent times to sit down with the Prime Minister and talk about some shared priorities, and there is a shared commitment to getting things done. The city deal is a framework, although not necessarily designed by the current Prime Minister. It's one that he's embraced. Our money's been on the table for a little bit longer than the Commonwealth Government's money. We would like to have been perhaps a little further advanced, but let's be positive. Let's focus on the fact that we now have that partnership, and there's an opportunity for us to get on with that green spine and the Mallop Street upgrade, things like the Convention Centre, things like the Shipwreck Coast Master Plan, all of those things, which ultimately are about jobs and about making the most of the rich assets that this region should be very, very proud of. I want to see in the next 12 months, having finally got that deal, having got the money secured from both governments, I want to see us take some of those concepts and some of those projects that we've become very good at talking about. I want to see them become the reality that they need to become. And I think we will make significant progress on each of those. And that's the highlights. There are some other elements involved in the city deal as well. But from our point of view, it's $191 million very well invested. From our point of view, we are very pleased to be in a much more cooperative position with the Commonwealth Government. And it's my expectation, and we'll work hard to deliver this, that we will be able to get lots done for lots of people right across Victoria through a much more productive partnership, certainly much more productive than perhaps has been the form over recent years. Now, I've spoken about the Geelong Arts Centre, Geelong Performing Arts Centre as it was known, Cardinia Park. There are many other significant projects. Some of them make big differences at a relatively small amount of money. Others are much bigger than that, but we, in this year's budget, delivered on all of the election commitments that we had made. We've made progress either in fully funding and therefore setting it up to fully deliver, or at least planning some of the early money that's needed. That's exactly the same approach that we took to our budget back in 2015, the very first budget after our first election victory. That, I hope, gives you that clear sense that we intend to govern in this, our second term, exactly the way we did in our first. Never wasting a moment, always working hard to deliver on the commitments we've made, but then also understanding that it's not just about one set of election commitments and not to go beyond that if you can, if there's capacity, and there's no shortage in this room and many like it of good ideas to go further. If we can go further, it's our commitment and it's our practice to listen and to try and add to what we think is already a substantial agenda. I'm certain you'll agree with that assessment because it's a substantial agenda that you helped to write, and that's why I think it was so strongly supported in this region. Now, there are many other issues I could go to, but I do fear I might get into that territory I said I would avoid, of standing here and telling you how good we are. There are a bunch of other projects. There are also a number of challenges, and I'm sure in questions these may be some of the issues people want to talk about. I talked about unemployment being in a very strong position, but there will always be challenges for us as we look to the future, and we want to remain focused on that. And that requires a detailed dialogue with individual sectors, individual businesses. We've just been talking about the Eden project just a couple of moments ago. That's one example where there can be creative opportunities to create more jobs, more visitors, greater prosperity. Again, to take advantage of natural assets, but also to turn problems and challenges into really important opportunities for the future. I know that it wouldn't be a local government forum at the moment without somebody raising the issue of waste and recycling. We know that's a very significant challenge. I'll be more than happy to take a question on that and to talk to you about some of the things that we're doing there and the vision that we have for a much more sustainable, a much more diverse, a much stronger industry, not one that's dominated by a player who has shown barely any regard for safety, barely any regard for their end clients. That's not just local government, but actual ratepayers. We do think we can get to that point. It's not easy, and it's not necessarily a 5-minute thing. Sometimes these things take time, but you're better to take the time and get it right rather than rushing out to placate the media or whomever might insist on an urgent answer. You're much better to get the thing right rather than get it done quickly. There are lots of other issues, lots of other challenges. I don't for a moment, despite my optimism and confidence for this region, for this partnership and for the future, I don't for a moment I don't for a moment have anything other than a really clear sense that there's always more that we have to do, and that's probably best demonstrated that the first budget is always about getting away those election commitments, and then if we can do more over time with capacity and with that culture of engagement and listening, then we stand ready to do that. That's the message that my Geelong and Geelong regional team always put to me. They're always very keen to make sure I understand exactly what's needed down here, and their list always grows. They're never happy with they're sometimes happy, but they're never happy to stop. They always want to do more, and that's what I think good local representatives are all about. That's what good dialogues like the one between our government and G21 are all about. That's why I'm here today, and that's why I'm more than happy to take your questions now.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned before, if you have a question for the Premier, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand very high, gentlemen down here at the front, and our microphone runners, and if you could identify yourself before you launch into your question, please.
Thank you, Mr Premier. Bob Merriman, the Mayor of the Jewel in the Crown, the Borough of Queenscliff.
Stolen my line, Bob.
Climate change.
Yes.
Given that continuous Labor governments have fully financially supported the examination of this beautiful coast, and we've also had outstanding support from the member for Ballerine, the Minister Neville, what we have discovered is that public and private assets along the Victorian coastline are increasingly susceptible to the impacts of climate change and more frequently severe weather events. My question and our question is, how will the state government invest in state and local government coastal assets to protect them against the impacts of climate change? Thank you, Premier.
Now, I've always known that Bob and Lisa get along well, but that's now put beyond all doubt with that question, I reckon. No, I'm sure you haven't. I'm sure you didn't caucus on that one. Thank you, Bob, and thank you for the acknowledgement that we have been very consistent in terms of our support. There are two issues here. We've been consistent with our support for a more diverse energy sector, and that, of course, is very closely linked to trying to reduce the carbon pollution that is seeing our climate change and our coastal communities increasingly having to deal with things that were theoretical once. They're very real now. They're very, very real. Now, I know I've just given you, at least part of my remarks are all about how we're getting along with the federal government much better these days, and I don't intend to cut across that by the next thing I'm going to say, but it was a bit disappointing when Mark McGowan, the Premier of WA, raised exactly the point you're raising about coastal communities in his state at the COAG meeting and sought a national response, a national approach to dealing with that issue, because you've got many assets. The problem is experienced by everybody, but who's responsible for it is a much harder thing to settle. So he wasn't looking to blame someone else. He was just looking for everybody to come together and take responsibility and come up with some sort of a national process. We couldn't quite get agreement on that. Commonwealth were not very keen to accept responsibility for that. However, we did finish up getting agreement that we'd use the CSIRO and others, I think that's where we landed, to get the best data and the best information and at least understand the problem better. The problem with that is, though, admiring a problem is not the same as doing something about it. Eloquently describing the problem is not the same as doing something about it. I think we're a bit diminished because we haven't got that national partnership. Having said that, though, I'm happy to come back to you with a very detailed answer on what it is we propose to do. I don't have to hand a list of things that we'll do, but we understand the issue, and it's why, just this week, we've had some very important legislation introduced into the Parliament, delivering on our commitments around 50% renewable energy. Some of our commitments around reducing carbon emissions by the same amount. All of that agenda is about being consistent and doing the things we can with the levers that we have access to, which is not all of them, sadly. Consistency is what's needed here. Like the problem doesn't go up and down. Like it's a constant, literally waves hitting the shore. It is there and it is getting worse. And anything other than a consistent policy response won't get it done. I am disappointed to have to report to you, although I think you already know this, we don't have consistent national policy responses on energy, on climate change, on the nature of the problem, the cause of the problem. It's a bit of a mess. But for our part, there is that consistency and clarity. Let me come back to you with some detailed, and it may well be that you have other ideas or at least a critical understanding of some of the ways the problem is presenting, and we can do better because of that.
And next question, a lady over there. Got a mic? Terrific.
Yes. Good morning, Premier. Frances Diver from Barwon Health, the Chief Executive. Thank you for the comments on Geelong Hospital. Delighted to hear you talk about Geelong Hospital, and also delighted to hear you talk about non-hospital settings, what we like to call Barwon Health Torquay. That's how we've termed it, following on from Barwon Health North, which will be opening in January this year,
Yes.
January next year. So very, very pleased to hear you talk about the health facilities. Just wanted to switch to a slightly related topic, which is mental health and alcohol and drug services.
Yes.
As you might imagine, we have grand plans for reforming our services, including community-based hubs and integrating our services. What I'm interested to hear is whether you've got any comments or early ideas or thoughts arising out of the Mental Health Royal Commission. You might know that we've been doing some innovative work with partnering with Ambulance Victoria that seems to be very successful in better responding to people with mental health crisis. But I just wondered whether you wanted to share with us any thoughts you have at this early stage in the Mental Health Royal Commission.
Thanks, Frances, and thanks for the work that you do at Barwon Health. I've known Frances for a long time through many different roles that she's played, and she's someone who understands our health system, and you won't find anybody, I think, more effective and more passionate about the best care for everybody who needs it. So thank you, Frances, and on behalf of the government, thanks through you to all of your team at Barwon Health. Now, I had 3 things to do today. So I've had most of the week I've been pretty crook. I've been under the weather. I can't shake this cold, but there were 3 things that I had to do. The first thing, I had to go to my daughter's school and speak to the entire school without embarrassing her. That was the key point. I managed to achieve that. Then, of course, I'm with you, and then I'm going to go to the Geelong Arts Centre in just a few moments. But this morning, one of the questions that came from 1,000 girls at her school, one of the questions was about, what do you think leadership, tell me what does leadership mean? I said, well, it means lots of different things, but let me give you an example. I think leadership is having the courage, you and your team, to call time when you don't have all the answers. Not to try and fake your way through, not to try and bluff your way through, but when you see something that's broken, when you haven't got all the answers on how to fix it, you've got to put your hand up and accept that that's a big part of effective leadership. Mental health is broken in our state, and not just in our state, but we can only deliver for our people. That's why we committed to Australia's first and only Royal Commission process, the highest and most formal level of inquiry that we can have, to start from scratch, to redesign the system, to confirm for us where the problems are, and then also give us a document that won't just bind my government, but a document that I think will be of such quality that it will lock in further reform for the governments that come after ours and the one that comes after them. And that's the sort of journey that we need to be on. It's been humbling to see so many people come forward with, again, courage that's far exceeds the courage of any politician to say, I don't know. The courage that sees people bear all and tell amazing stories, powerful, deeply personal stories about how the system has failed them. And we thank them, we're very grateful to them. There's often a discussion about the missing middle. So we have pretty good system at raising awareness, a pretty good system where people can perhaps have intake services at a very primary, lower level, high prevalence disorder level. Not to diminish them, but it's that part of the system is not so bad. The acute system, there's a volume issue, enough beds, enough capacity, enough workforce in the right places. But if you are genuinely unwell, then there is a system at least that you'll be able to, if not get into, then you can queue up for it. The missing middle, though, after that psychotic episode, after you've been critically unwell, what are you referred back to? What do you step down to? If you're someone who's living with mental illness, 1 in 5 of us do, and you're changing medication, and you've got some apprehension about what that might mean, where do you step up to? There's no middle in this system, and it needs to fundamentally change. There's no question people are dying. Carers, loved ones, families, workers in this system they're being let down fundamentally, and of course patients, clients are being fundamentally let down as well. The early thinking, I would be surprised if we don't we've obviously got a report in November and one again at the end of next year. I don't think we'll get the A to Z in the first report. We'll get some things that need to be acted on now, and we won't waste any time doing that, because just like family violence, we've committed to implement every single one of the findings that come forward. I think this middle issue will be high on the priority list of Penny Armitage and her team. I think that the notion of step up and down care, these sort of prevention and recovery care centres, something that can be as safe as a hospital from a clinical point of view, but is much more home style, much more community, ambulatory style, where there's a sense of trust and ownership. So it's not a purely clinical environment. It's not a place where you would necessarily go because you are unwell. It'd be a place you would go because it's a part of the continuum of getting better. And the notion of maintenance away from the most expensive level of care, which is usually the most intrusive, the least pleasant level of care as well. No commentary on anyone who provides it. It's just the way it is. No one wants to be admitted into a psychiatric ward. And there will be an unavoidable group of people who every year do need that. But at the same time, we should be driving those numbers down. We should be minimising those numbers by keeping people well, keeping people supported in a continuous sense. I could go on. This is an area of great interest and passion to me. Lisa is a former mental health minister. Me as a former health minister, this is unfinished business. And I don't know that I'll necessarily get to finish it. It's going to be a big, long journey to build the system that every Victorian is fundamentally entitled to. But the first step in that, and in some respects the most difficult step in that, was to say, listen, it's broken. And I'm not going to try and bluff my way through anymore and tell you that it isn't. It's broken and we need to fix it. And that's where the Royal Commission process comes from. And you can track back, not every problem in our community, but so many of our problems in our community come from the fact that this system doesn't work. We talk about violence. We talk about all manner of carnage and difficulties that we've had to endure, all of us, from Burke Street to all number of other incidents that are in people's private homes. We talk about drugs. We talk about alcohol. We talk about so many different problems, and so many of them can be traced back to the fact that we don't have an alcohol and other drugs sector that is as strong as it should be, and a mental health sector that's as strong as it should be. Finally, and I know I haven't answered your question because I can't tell you what's in the report. I don't know, but I am optimistic and I'm hopeful that they're going to do good work, because they're good people and we chose them very, very carefully for their different life experience and the different contribution that they'll make. Very thoughtful people, and they're going to do a really good job. I'm confident of that. But the key point here is the cost of failure is enormous, absolutely enormous. The cost of the fact that this system doesn't work is enormous, and we're all paying it in dollar terms, in human terms, in emotional terms. And I just think this is the time to do something really significant. And it won't just be a better mental health system, it'll be a better health system as well, because it becomes the safety net. The emergency department at your hospital becomes the safety net. AMBO's become the last resort. The list goes on and on. But it's not about being negative. I think there is a real sense of, there's a positive sense that we're going to make some substantial change out of this.
Do you get into trouble if you interrupt the Premier?
No, it's all right.
I think you do. Mr Premier, I know there are many, many more questions out there in the audience, but as
I can try and give a shorter answer maybe.
Well, no, I've got the team telling me that you have to be somewhere else, so...
we can do one more, I'm sure.
If we can do one quick
as long
one...
as the person who asked it doesn't make me regret that.
And one very short answer, if you wouldn't mind. Sure. Perhaps the lovely lady down here in the front. Thank you. And I would urge you, Mr Premier, for some brevity, if you wouldn't mind.
You think you're going to get in more trouble than me for being late?
Yep, quite possibly.
Right. Francis asked me about mental health. That was always going to take a while. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm Deborah Haygarth from Women with Disabilities Victoria. I'm in the Barwon hub of that. Look, I applaud the Victorian government and their state plan for people with a disability that talks about absolutely everyone. Achieving this, though, it's the inclusive and accessibility. In this state, it's continuously being undermined by a lack of accessible transport, including an appalling lack of maxi taxis. What can you do about this, Premier?
It's a very good question, Deborah, and thank you for raising the issue. Let me come back to you on the exact record of our government in the last 4.5 years. But as I understood it, we've had a review into this issue, as it was important to listen to those who use maxi taxis in a specific sense. And it was my understanding that the Minister Allen, who did have responsibility for this, had in fact issued some new licences. Whether that's enough, that's another issue. But I do understand that it is a real problem in terms of getting enough people to do this work. Those who do it, in my experience, have a real passion for it and do a fantastic job, and we're in their debt. The issuing of more licences is not, that's not too much. It's not too hard. It wouldn't be something we couldn't do. In fact, I think we have. But if I get your details before I leave, I'm more than happy to write to you, and I'll give you a call if you like and give you the details of what we have done. And then I'm sure you'll say that isn't enough, because it probably isn't. But we need to be guided by users about what the next step should look like. Maybe more licences isn't the issue, because maybe they'll all just get gobbled up in Melbourne. Maybe we need to look at where those licences are, where those drivers are. And
There is a thing with it, in Geelong itself, the cabs in the morning. I can't get a cab early in the morning. If I want to go to,
which is probably exactly when you need one.
if I want to go to work,
Yeah.
I just can't, or want to come here. I
Right.
can't get a
I'll
cab
tell you what
because
we'll
they're
do.
too
Why don't-
busy taking the school
I'll
kids.
get your details,
Yeah.
and why don't I give you a call next week, and we can have a discussion. I think through you telling me your story,
Yep.
I'll probably better understand the broader
Thank you so
issue.
much.
Thanks very much,
That's
Deborah.
great.
Thank
Thank
you all.
for that. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please thank the Premier, Mr. Daniel Andrews. Ooh. It's a trap. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank the Premier. Well, time to move on, and would you now please welcome back to the stage the Chair of G21, Bill Mithen, to introduce our very special keynote speaker, Patricia Karvelas.
Thanks, Lee, and once again, thank you, Premier, for your words. Just as we might just wait as they depart. So I think it's been a fairly incredible morning already, and some incredible speeches, and possibly the best to come, I suspect. So it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Patricia. Patricia Karvelas is the presenter of RN Drive and has been a prominent senior journalist in the Australian media for 15 years, beginning her professional career in broadcast journalism at the ABC and SBS as both a producer and presenter. She has worked for the Australian newspaper since 2002, covering federal politics. That's an interesting period of time to cover federal politics, Patricia. Most recently working as the Victorian Bureau Chief and Editor and Senior National Affairs Journalist. Patricia specialised in Indigenous affairs reporting for more than 10 years. Patricia has been a regular fill-in presenter on 774 ABC, and I'm sure many of you have heard her on that, and frequently appears on a range of television and radio programs, including RN's Sunday Extra and ABC TV's The Drum. Please welcome Patricia to the stage.
Okay, now before I begin, I want everyone to stand up and just kind of move. I know, right? You commit to coming to one of these things, you want to engage, you want to hear, but it really is a long time to sit down and listen to people. Thank you very much. All right, get your sillies out, as I say to my very little children. Thank you so much. And I've got to say, Usually I come after politicians regularly and I'm like, I'm going to nail this because that was pretty average. Daniel Andrews is actually an incredibly good communicator. I've got to say, he's a premier that communicates fantastically with people. So he's not here. I don't like to give politicians compliments, but I have to be fair, that was quite an amazing presentation. So let's just give him a round of applause. Don't mean to sound impolite, but good journalists don't want to give politicians too many compliments. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people, their elders past, present and emerging, and of course pay my respects. Not just because people do that, but because it matters for a very important reason. This country is not new, this country is ancient, and there are people who have been here for a very long time. And I think we need to think about that when we come to these things, because if we don't, I think we forget about how much collective knowledge we actually have, rather than reinventing the wheel all of the time and thinking that, you know, we've got new solutions that we can come up with, when in fact probably some of the answers have been here for thousands of years. So I'm going to let you in on a little how the sausage is made game, right? It's a bit of a secret. Anyone who knows me here knows I make it a bit of a practice to unmask politics. I don't think politics should be something that's opaque, that, you know, only journalists and politicians have secret squirrel information. I think people should know about what we do, how we come to the conclusions we come to. So I'm just going to let you in on the federal election campaign and the kind of way that that all ended, which I know is shocking to many people, but I reckon I can give you a few insights. A few times during the election campaign, I would do what most diligent journalists do and call around my best political contacts to find out how they were viewing things on the ground and what their own data was telling them about how Australia was about to vote. As the weeks rolled on, what became obvious to me was that something was happening that wasn't being reflected in the published polls. Labor hardheads were telling me they were very, very, very nervous. PK, I'm freaking out. It's just, I don't know, people won't take our how to vote cards at pre-polls. I'm like, that's a bit unusual. Apparently Labor's about to romp it in. It seemed a little amiss. They said they were worried about the scare campaigns being run against their enormous policy agenda, and they thought that some of the lines that Scott Morrison was using were biting, and we now know that they were doing a little more than biting. And on the other side of the political divide, some Liberals and Nationals were telling me that we in the mainstream media were missing a big story. Again, they were right. Now, we really did miss something. They were telling us there was no mood for change. There was no love for Bill Shorten. In Queensland, one very senior Liberal source, who I now trust more than I've ever trusted, because he told me things that happened. In fact, he predicted it all. Told me that there were baseball bats out for Labor. That was the language I last heard when Paul Keating was defeated in Queensland. He said it was very similar. I took all that intelligence, but I couldn't reconcile it with the published wall-to-wall polling, which told me the opposite story. I knew instinctively, after a career of about 20 years in political journalism, that, you know, it didn't feel like a change of government election, didn't have that kind of vibe about it. But generally, I believe in metrics, and I thought, I'm kind of not going to report on a vibe, so I'll just stick to what the published polling is saying and what some of the internal polling allegedly was saying as well. Now, I had a feeling also that I could be wrong, you know, I've heard that's possible, and that my sources must be, in the case of the coalition, overconfident, which is very possible, and in the case of Labor, deeply paranoid because, you know, lots of bad things have happened in the past to them. And they were kind of a bit, you know, bruised by history. So like most bubble dwellers, I'm going to use the word bubble quite a bit because the Prime Minister uses it and I've just stolen it. Like most bubble dwellers, which clearly I am, I trusted Australian political polling because that's all we had to rely on, and it had largely been accurate up until that point. In fact, you know, the Australian newspaper that published News Poll, that was like the Bible for politics. You know, that said what was going to happen. That was until it wasn't. The new political landscape has demolished our trust in political polling, so don't believe it. Academics and political analysts are grappling with what this is all about, why these epic fails have happened. Of course, they've happened in other places too. Think Brexit, think the US. And there's a lot of theories now about what the so-called shy voter is. It's a new cool term for people who lie on the survey. That's all it is. They just mislead survey people because they think, oh, I don't think I should admit that I'm doing this, but they are planning to do it. And the influence of outside powers as well. Of course, we've been talking about foreign influence. We've been talking about, exactly how our political system may be being corrupted at different levels. So this kind of discussion was happening inside the bubble, but it's now happening very much outside the bubble too, whichever bubble you might be hanging out in. So if these pollsters got this election wrong, and they really did spectacularly get it wrong. I mean, I was sort of consoling people at the Labor Party headquarters party in the bathrooms. People were really quite shattered. I'd never seen anything like it. So if people got it so wrong, is it the case then, which I think it is, that they also got it wrong when they rolled 2 Liberal Prime Ministers based on what essentially was wrong polling, right? Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott were rolled ostensibly, with Malcolm Turnbull it's a bit of a more complex story, but on polling, and all of that polling has been wrong. I'm sharing this kind of personal insight into how I go about my work because I think it's important to acknowledge in this room, you're all really smart, informed people that want to find out what our political leadership is going to do and how they've made their decisions. Well, so far a lot of their decisions have been made on fake stuff, on misleading surveys, unfortunately. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the media establishment, that the political establishment got the May 18 election completely wrong. But context matters, and I think it wasn't just all of that data that made some of those conclusions happen. The other reason was this mantra we'd always believed, which has clearly is not a thing anymore, which is that disunity is death, right? And we all know that before the last election, they were literally stabbing each other. It was not pretty, let me tell you. And they were very upfront about it, the federal government. They were not happy campers. Now, if you look at history, actually disunity has not been death for a few people. If you look at Gillard, she got re-elected. Sure, it was minority. A lot of disunity there, yet re-elected. You look at Turnbull, everyone knew there were issues there, yet he got elected. So I think we need to kind of rewrite the rules of politics a bit. Clearly disunity is not the death we thought it was. Other things are motivating voters. And that's what I want to explore here, that clearly that's not the story, the idea that it's all just about how they're getting along or the way they're governing. So the May election has rewritten some rules, but I reckon it's reinforced some other political home truths. When the Prime Minister claimed he had always believed in miracles upon claiming victory on election night, what struck me was that the result was anything but a miracle. This is not to undermine the concept of a miracle or begin a theological debate that I'm not going to win, but what we saw happen on May 18th was not an aberration. I think that is a false reading of what happened. It was actually a very coherent response from an electorate that had made up its mind that it did not want to change everything. And Bill Shorten said he wanted to change everything. The electorate thought, no, we don't want to change everything. Doesn't mean they didn't want to improve things, but they decided that this idea of upending everything was too much. And that Labor had too many policies that carried too many risks. Australians didn't want to take those risks. So Scott Morrison defied years of opinion polls, which we now know were wrong anyway, to lead the coalition to what people have described almost universally as a shock election victory, although now we know not so shocking. My thesis today is that there is in some ways nothing shocking about what happened. What the election result provides, and I think this is exciting for this room, is a potential period for quiet policy achievement. Quiet achievement. And I use the word quiet very deliberately, and I'm going to start whispering now. If the policy agenda is not jammed, and it isn't jammed, we know that, there is the ability to actually build a consensus around new, big, brave policy ideas, right? To make a case for change that builds Australia, that makes Australia better. If the cupboard isn't overfilled, there's room to talk and potentially to talk loudly, to stop being so quiet. The Prime Minister talks about the quiet Australians. Put your hand up if you identify as a quiet Australian. That doesn't mean how you vote, by the way. I just want to make that clear. It's more about, no, I knew it. Wrong room! There are quiet Australians. The Prime Minister talks about them. You're not them. But he talks about the quiet Australians. What he's really now trying to deliver is a period of quiet government. He's accurately determined that voters are very sick of the noise coming out of Canberra, like really sick of it, like fatigued by it. I love Canberra. I lived there for a decade. I report on Canberra every day, but I'm tired of Canberra. So I figure when my fatigue is at this level, I think there's a reason the electorate's behaving this way too. So he's decided, the Prime Minister, that if he delivers quietly for a little while, he'll be rewarded for it. And I actually reckon he's right, if he can do it. Now, we're going to play a little game now. He's out of the room, actually. I would have loved to put this to him. A little game of compare and contrast. It's worth for a moment just focusing on the election result at the state level, right? The last state election, when Daniel Andrews romped home for a second term here in Victoria. At the time, Liberals feared they would be dead at the next federal poll, and yet they weren't. But while there was no doubt the sting of Malcolm Turnbull's removal in that state Liberal result, 100% it was part of it. It wasn't the whole story. The biggest story by far was that the electorate, the Victorian electorate, actually wanted to reward Daniel Andrews for doing stuff, for actually being a competent government. The electorate isn't so disrupted it doesn't want to reward governments. It does when they do their job. So he was rewarded for facilitating growth, building stuff. Now, the November poll, I think, shows us that a government that can demonstrate that it is prepared to build, that it is prepared to invest in vital infrastructure, grow its state, talk about building the state, will be rewarded with re-endorsement. It's a no-brainer. It's actually a mystery to me. It astonishes me that political parties need scores of advisors and analysts, machine men, they are largely men, to figure this out. So Melbourne's fast-growing population, expected to pass 8 million by 2050 to become Australia's largest city, meant Daniel Andrews zoomed in on infrastructure very deliberately. He figured it out early. If I just deliver, people will reward me. The other noise will be, to some extent, not entirely rewarded, will be ignored. His win has been described as an infrastructure landslide, and I believe, this is the compare and contrast, that Scott Morrison, I don't just believe this, I've spoken to people, watched that success and mimicked it, right? I know that's kind of crazy, like a centre-right leader who's quite different to Daniel Andrews, looking at Daniel Andrews and thinking, what can I learn here? But that's the kind of guy Scott Morrison is. That's actually what he did to some extent. Not entirely, but it was part of his project. So his pitch was actually not that dissimilar. And I know there's been a reported bromance between the Premier and the Prime Minister. I reckon that's absolutely confirmed by the speech that the Premier just gave, where things are going so well, the relationship is so strong. I know there was a whiskey shared and, these are two leaders who are so smart that they've figured out that if they just get on with it and work together and deliver, that they might both nail the next election too. This is very pragmatic. And the bromance, I am now very certain, is a thing. So Scott Morrison's plan in May, I thought maybe people are exaggerating that speech. Woo, I reckon that is quite newsworthy, as I'll tell my colleagues later. Scott Morrison's plan in May involved billions for road upgrades and car parks. I mean, the Prime Minister was building car parks in Victoria all of a sudden. We thought that the government was going to get thrown out, but he was just busy talking about car parks and infrastructure, and we all missed this bigger story, right? Because he figured out that, everyone kept talking about Bill Shorten was on the rise, or the Labor Party rather was on the rise, but really the success in Melbourne, or at least what he was able to achieve, which was, not being slammed like he thought he was going to be, was because he essentially got busy at that level. So there were two messages running for the coalition. One was, of course, on those big income tax cuts, which are now legislated after some soul-searching from Labor. And then a super local campaign, which you all know better than anyone in this electorate. Most of these promises and campaigns barely registered on the national stage, right? Like we were just not that engaged in those kind of, 20 million for this, 5 million for this, because at a national macro level, we're thinking about, big ideas. And yet this is the stuff that they were doing, and I think delivered them largely the result they saw. Quietly and methodically, key promises were being made to win these marginal electorates across the country. So we sit here in Corangamite, one of my favourite electorates, and I'm not just saying it. There's a hilarious photo of me at one, very overfed, in bikinis. Why would you put a 1-year-old in a bikini? Anyway, Greek parents. And in Torquay, at Torquay Beach. So this is a place I've spent a lot of my childhood as well. And I can tell you that this seat of Corangamite, really, you got so much action, I don't know. You're probably so tired you need a holiday from just the activity in this electorate during the election campaign. So I know the coalition ultimately lost this electorate. Now, we know why that's the case. There was a redistribution. It was notionally Labor. It was going to go to Labor. But the fact that the coalition, the Liberal Party, was in the hunt still, in a seat that really should have been written off, alarm bells should have been going off. Why are they still hanging out in this seat when apparently they're about to be, smashed to the extent where there's going to be 5 of them left in the parliament? Why are they hanging out in Corangamite, which is meant to now be notionally a Labor seat? It speaks volumes of the fact that what the Prime Minister says was a miracle wasn't a miracle. He knew what was going on the ground, that the message wasn't quite clear. So now infrastructure is our new story. What's happened now is that there's an infrastructure tsunami, right? There's no infrastructure peace deal. Yes, there are some differences, and I could go through all the differences. The $3 billion for the East-West Link motorway. Daniel Andrews doesn't want that. Prime Minister does. There are still things which are going to hurt the bromance, potentially. The $50 billion suburban rail loop to be built by 2050. The feds are like, we're not so into that. So, there are fault lines, but these 2 layers of government, they're actually on message on many things in terms of what the electorate wants. So our political zeitgeist now is about infrastructure, and I expect that pitch to get louder and louder and louder. At the national level, of course, the federal government's got this $100 billion it wants to spend, but watch that perhaps shift. I mean, we talk about these economic headwinds, we talk about stimulus. The government hasn't committed, but will they bring forward some spending? Because a lot of it happens right down the end of those 10 years. So expect more in that space. That's my big prediction. So just in terms of what we've learnt over the last, 5 months, Labor got itself into all sorts of self-inflicted pain by developing a bold and what their opponents say is a radical policy agenda premised on killing franking credits and curbing negative gearing. Essentially, Labor just did too much, confused too many people, scared too many people, picked too many groups off. Too many people were going to be losers in their agenda according to the way people voted. And you've got to respect the way people vote. You can't argue with voters. And if you do, you're just going to keep losing. The coalition was on message. It kept it simple. The Prime Minister really didn't miss. He has been absolutely on message since too. And don't forget the elephant in the room, jobs. Jobs is the elephant in the room. I'm going to get back to jobs in a moment, but the jobs message, I reckon, is the biggest one here. What's crystal clear is that governments, once elected, can change the country. But voters generally only want to change the government. They don't want to change the government, the country, the everything. The Hawke-Keating period demonstrates that the case for big changes is best made from government, not from opposition. So what does that mean in terms of future oppositions? We'll have other elections. Does it mean everyone will be too gun-shy? Well, my prediction is a little bit yes. Doesn't mean, though, never say never, that you won't see other big ideas be developed by, well, the Labor opposition federally or the Liberals here in Victoria. You'll get ideas, but you won't get 3,000 ideas in one day. I think political leaders have learnt a few lessons in the last year. I just want to touch on a few things in my speech before I want to take questions. Hopefully we'll have enough time because I love questions. I just want to talk about Adani and climate change. And you've raised issues of climate with the Premier. I think this is a huge one. Remember how we were going to have a climate change election? Well, now we've got a new parliamentary friends group for coal exports. And there's a Labor co-chair of that group, Joel Fitzgibbon. So it just shows us how an election can change everything. We know that public polls, for instance, show climate change matters to 80% or more of the electorate, right? We know that. And yet, what became crystal clear in this election is that this does not necessarily mean that it's a vote changer in the way that people kept telling us it would be. I'm sorry, but it was not a vote switcher. There is no evidence that people demonstrably voted like we were told they would for a climate change election. I want to put a little caveat on this because there is an important one. This isn't to say that voters don't want action on climate change. That is not the message. That's a dumb reductionist message. In fact, in Victoria, where I think we will still keep seeing action in the next election, I think Victoria is now on the map as a player in elections federally, and I think this is good for Victorians, of course. In the inner city parts of Melbourne and Sydney, for instance, in some of those leafy Liberal suburbs, yes, people like Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, didn't lose Kooyong, but they got a scare because climate change does matter to some voters. Prime Minister is a very smart man. He knows this. He knows that the message isn't just Queensland didn't want action because of Adani, so we're not going to do anything. And that's why I think you need to listen very carefully to the nuanced way the government's trying to go forward, right? It's in a very wicked problem here because it's got a wicked problem because, of course, the coalition party room is not united on these issues. I think Daniel Andrews described it as a mess. I don't think that's inaccurate. It's a bit of a messy situation, but I don't think the Prime Minister wants to pull out of Paris, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, or abandon all of his previous commitments. He pivoted already. Think about Snowy 2.0, his talk about Tasmanian hydro. There's already been a shift. Now, I want to address this. I think this is a huge one. I know there's been a big backlash against Queensland, particularly in Victoria, right? And you're Victorians, so let's have this conversation. I dare say that's what got us into this trouble in the first place. I've got a really strong view on this. You don't build a nation by belittling your fellow Australians. It's not only politically counterproductive, but I think it's actually worse. It's dangerous to national cohesion. When I heard this whole, let's get rid of Queensland right after the election campaign from people who felt perhaps disappointed, I thought, that's kind of why they hate you. This whole down south comes and tells us what to think. I don't think it's a very smart way of doing national politics. If anything, the post-election political environment provides, I think, a good opportunity to build a bridge, to understand what motivates voters and how political leadership best responds in a policy sense to these different agendas or different needs, right? Okay, so in Queensland, yes, there was an Adani response based on this fear about jobs. And in Geelong, you guys get that. You get what the fear about jobs is like. Let's not belittle people who are worried about their jobs. I think it's really counterproductive and really nasty to assume that people are motivated, they're selfish. Well, what does that mean? Of course, people vote for their families and their own prospects. So how do you deliver something for people that actually addresses their own needs and doesn't kind of paint them as if they're these northerners that are stupid? They're not. You've got to actually read between the lines. So what on climate change can we expect? Well, I don't think you should be so pessimistic, right? I don't think the Prime Minister has written it off or doesn't believe in it. The fact that the Prime Minister consistently says he does believe that climate change is a thing, I think shows that he is trying somehow to find the middle ground on this. So I want to return to bubble land. What's next, right? What can we expect? And I'm going over time, so let me just get to bubble land. The big question is, which bubble will the new Morrison cabinet decide to float in? Where will it decide to go? Because all prime ministers want to change the country. That's what they want to do. So how do they want to change the country? Can it straddle this divide between the north and the south? Because there is a divide, and that's why I think it's important that we bridge it, all of us as citizens. And also this false dichotomy that troubles me deeply between aspiration and fairness. One of the messages from the election is not that Australians don't want fairness. What they didn't want was Bill Shorten's agenda for fairness. That doesn't mean they don't want fairness. It's naive to make that assumption. And I can tell you that I don't think that very senior members of the government think that. You know, I know there's some that have come out. I think Matthias Cormann gave a speech the other day. It was quite controversial on some of these issues. But broadly, I think there are very smart members of that cabinet who do know that the message is a bit more complex. Maybe not Bill Shorten's version of fairness, but fairness is a real thing in this country and people care about it and people want it delivered. So I reckon I can give you a big steer on where they might go. Thousands of words have been written about a pretty light policy agenda for the government. I was one of the journalists who did spend a lot of time during the election campaign hammering certain ministers about, well, what else? What are you going to do for 3 years? I think that's a relevant question still. What will they do for 3 years? So they've legislated a 10-year tax package and they got it through, and you've got to credit to them. They put it to the electorate and now they've legislated it. But what are they going to do? Well, there's a few booby traps for them, and unless the Prime Minister gets busy filling in the space, well, I reckon some of his colleagues might do it for him. They don't want to die wondering. They've told me this, right? His colleagues will start being very busy very soon. Think about some of the breakouts we've already had. New Start. All of these people coming out saying they want an increase in New Start. The government hasn't changed its position yet, but the fact that so many are willing to break lines shows that they don't want to waste this term. That's one example. Nuclear power is another one. The fact that there's even an inquiry and so many people are raising this is another one. Superannuation is another one. These are all policy breakouts because I think there has been a bit of a vacuum in terms of what is being talked about, and so you're going to hear more and more noise, not necessarily destabilising the way we saw it with Turnbull, where they just wanted to roll a Prime Minister, allegedly it seemed, but more about not wanting to die wondering, not wanting to waste this third term, because we might have a newish Prime Minister, but actually it's kind of an old government. This is their third term. So there are a few booby traps emerging. I call them booby traps. One of them is in the press today, and that's religious freedoms. There are people in the coalition who want the government to go further. So far, though, the proposal that the Prime Minister has offered on that has been quite centre-right, quite moderate. It shows that he understands the concept of middle Australia. He knows he can't go too far. On another one, constitutional recognition, the Premier started talking about this in his treaty process. Well, there is a big proposal. It's the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The government has walked away from that central statement. Where does it go next on this? Because this is now a situation where Indigenous Australians want something that the government seems to be refusing to deliver. They do not want a legislated body, they want it in the Constitution. Watch this continue to be an issue for the government. And then the other area I think they're going to have some issues around delivering on is big promises, but how do they do it? And that's on, well, it affects you very deeply, the regions and immigration. They want to talk about regional immigration. They want more and more people moving to the regions. But how are they going to do it? Because policies have failed on this for decades. How do you actually make it work? So ultimately, these are the kind of challenges we're going to see the government facing. But at the same time, the big key message for me is pragmatism. The Prime Minister is one of the most pragmatic people I have ever seen in politics. Really, I think I haven't seen this kind of pragmatism since John Howard, who, you know, remember everyone said, oh, wow, he's meant to be this kind of dry right-wing guy, and yet middle-class welfare was never bigger under anyone than it was under John Howard. That's because he was a pragmatist. He realised that this was an area that voters responded well to. I think that this Prime Minister is very similar. So I reckon now there's a big challenge for the Prime Minister. How does he want to redefine Australia? And will he be the pragmatist he promises to be? My view is that he is not an ideologue. He might have strong ideology. That's not to say he doesn't have strong ideology. You know, we've heard about his strong religious convictions. But so far there's evidence that he knows how to park them in order to deliver for the middle, which is where you win elections. I reckon it's best not to underestimate this government, and I want to return to that bromance, which is a bit of a theme here if we look at the levels. we've got two tiers of government that have rightly diagnosed that the electorate is bored of noise, is bored of infighting, and just wants results. And both of them are committed to staying off the front page for the wrong reasons. They want to be on for the right reason. They like the glamour. They don't want to be on for the wrong reasons. Let's see if they can stick to it, and I'm really happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. That was fantastic. So I'm wondering if you can make some comments about pragmatism and leadership and whether those two things work together or whether they work against each other.
Not only do they work together, they are like the perfect romance, actually. Good leaders are pragmatic. And that's what I mean. I actually think at a state level, I'm not a fangirl of any politician. I don't care if they hate me. In fact, I see it as a badge of honour when they dislike me, because I think that means probably I've done my job well, right? But I also believe in saying what I witness and what I see. And what I see at the state level and at the federal level right now, I think it can change. So, don't hold me to it. Ask me in 6 months, because things can change very quickly in politics. We've seen that. The 24-hour news cycle, which I am part of, is incredibly fast moving and can really shift the optics. But at this stage, we're seeing at the state and the federal level two of the most pragmatic politicians I've seen for a long time, right? And the reason that they both had electoral success is because of that pragmatism. Both of them, for the Prime Minister from the right, for Daniel Andrews from the left, their big challenge is not caving into their own constituencies too much. And what I mean by that is you will always be pressured from your own, extremer edges to deliver on things that might be hobby horses for people. Smart, political, pragmatic leaders say, hey, we might love that idea. Think about work choices. That they might love that idea on paper. One of my great contacts in the coalition, federal politician, Liberal, said to me, some of my ideas, right, they're great on paper, I love them. I'm not going to go try and legislate them. Not because he doesn't think they're good ideas, by the way, not because he really knows secretly they're not. No, he thinks they're great ideas, but because he understands where Australia's at. That's the pragmatism. You've got to read the electorate if you want to win. And then convince the electorate slowly by building a consensus to go your way. And I think the government did that, for instance, with the tax cuts. Labor kept saying they're so unfair. Well, clearly the electorate didn't think so. And then the Prime Minister managed to get the Parliament to get them legislated, and now his 10-year package is legislated, so Labor will have to repeal it or change it to change it. I mean, that's quite an achievement in many ways. That's pragmatism.
Hi, thanks, Patricia. You mentioned that you think Scott Morrison is, should we say, open on climate change as an issue, at least sticking to their existing position. I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on what might make them shift, particularly towards taking some action, and thinking about the context of 20th of September, we're going to have global strikes, climate strikes in Australia and around the world, and 23rd of September, there's the UN Climate Summit where Scott Morrison will be in New York, whether you think that will have a bearing on getting the government to shift and take some action on climate.
Yeah, look, I think the election victory, particularly the Queensland result, and that's what I was trying to demonstrate, has actually emboldened the government about its climate position. So you might be disappointed with that answer, but I'm just telling you the facts. I think they feel like the electorate said no to a more ambitious target, no to trying to transition out of coal. That's why we've seen Labor's re-embrace of the coal industry. Now, of course, everyone, even the government knows that there's going to be a transition away from coal in the longer term. Even the government, that Prime Minister doesn't actually not say that that's going to be a thing. But now we're talking about, the Liddell power plant, for instance, extending its life. I actually think the government feels like it's been given an endorsement for its climate change position from the electorate. In terms of the way it may behave, I think the Pacific Islands Forum is a really good instructive moment because, of course, that statement then goes to the UN, and we saw the government obviously trying to water down the language around coal. You know, it was all very dramatic and being successful. So I'm not convinced that we're going to see the kind of action you might want to see, but I do think that the Prime Minister's smart enough to know that's why he's not a climate change denier. And I think that's important to note. He doesn't question the science around climate change. He might question the kind of pace and the transition, but not actually the fundamentals. And I do think that's worth noting. I think it does matter that the messages they've received in a seat like Kooyong, Josh Frydenberg, people like that around the cabinet table. Remember, Josh Frydenberg's baby, the National Energy Guarantee, was murdered by his own party room. He's now the treasurer. He still thought it was a good idea. So there are people around the table who do think that, you know, you need a cohesive, good policy setting. So I don't see any immediate sort of, they're going to go to the UN and have some sort of ambitious ambition around, you know, coal transition. But I do think that the position is more nuanced than you'd think.
Thank you. I'm going to do something really unusual. We've got time probably for one more quick question. And Patricia, would you mind taking the handle? Because we've got to change the set
Yeah, sure.
for a panel discussion.
I'll do whatever you want me to do.
Well, it just means they can get another question. And
I'll try not to dance. Yes? Where is the question? Hello.
Thanks for that. Andrew Crowley from Deakin University. In this room, there's no people probably under 30 years of age.
Do you know that for sure?
Well, put your hand up if you're under
30.
30.
Stand. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
you're
good.
wrong.
That's
You're
good.
wrong.
Fantastic. What more? Fantastic.
That's why
Bad
I believe
assumption.
in fact-checking.
Very good.
All right, it's fair
Small
to say they're in
percent.
a
Small
deep
percentage.
minority.
Yeah. And that's what I wanted to ask is, in terms of the political landscape, after the plebiscite, there was a talk that they were going to influence, hopefully, sort of get involved in voting and influence the election. Did the political parties genuinely take that on board and think about that, and did it at all come into shaping of
No, it didn't come into fruition. No, but you're right. Okay, so it ended up not being a plebiscite. I'm being a bit of a nerd, but it was a postal survey.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It wasn't a plebiscite. They didn't get the plebiscite through. The ABS ran it. Bit of a strange time for Australia. But yes, we all voted, I think. And yes, a lot of young people put themselves on the electoral roll, which I think was incredible and, if anything, one of its biggest achievements, that process, that it got so many young people engaged in the political process. We are experiencing demographic change, but we're not there yet. What the election actually did demonstrate is that I think older Australians still own political influence. Younger people are concentrated too in different places. I do think that I don't think we saw what was quite predicted. But demographic change is a slow burner. The country's changing. It's bigger than just young people. Look at the changing colour of our country. I mean, multiculturalism, right? Like, of course, I'm a product of multiculturalism. My parents are Greek migrants. But this country is changing a lot, and I think that poses different challenges because the parliament doesn't look like the country. So that might take a while, but at some point you kind of have to look like your country if you want to represent your country, if I can say it ever so subtly. Read between the lines.
just busy moving furniture in the background, so thank you. You've been really generous. Ladies and gentlemen, would you thank our fabulous keynote speaker, Patricia Karvelas. Razor-sharp insights from Patricia. That was really fabulous. So apologies, everybody, while we were busy moving the furniture in the background. Well, that's interesting. Interesting setup. All right. So now to the first panel discussion of the day. And as a resource, it presents one of the greatest challenges of our time. And of course, I'm talking about water. So how do we approach the future? That will be the topic for our first panel discussion today, which will be hosted by the chair of Barwon Water, Jo Plummer, who I thought might want to sit with the team, but I don't know how they do this. Anyway, so would you welcome Jo? Come on. So, I don't know whether
We've got this nailed.
you've got it.
Good.
All
We've
right.
got this nailed.
So joining Jo on stage are Kylie Cochrane, the International Chair of the International Association for Public Participation. Welcome. Also, Dr. Benjamin Henley, the Research Fellow, the School of Earth Sciences at the University of Melbourne. And Tracey Slatter, the Managing Director of Barwon Water. Please make them all welcome.
Without water, the Aggressy Golf Club doesn't exist. Grass needs a few things to grow, and water is one of those things. That's the essential element.
When drought hit, we were closing ovals, and the impact of that alone really hit home. Where my kids playing their sport now, well, they may not be. That changed people's minds about the way they use water.
So our business, we make craft beer, so water is a pretty core ingredient to that. So to be connected to a water source that's so fresh is a really big part of the identity of our product.
There's a large percent of our residents that don't have mains water. It's really tough out there during those dry spells. I know my colleague I was working with last week was complaining about the argument he had with his daughter because she's spending too long in the shower.
When we do use water, we've got to do it with a regard to where we're taking it from and making sure that we care for them properly by not overdoing it.
At Scotsman's Hill, we've been using recycled water now for over 20 years. It's really critical to our business, and without it we wouldn't have been able to expand.
That drought showed us the importance of water. When there's a crisis, people understand or they try to learn more. People's behaviour did change.
Wadawurrung people have a deep connection to water. It connects us to our creation stories, connects us to all things living and each other.
You go in a situation where you've got restrictions, you learn a lot of lessons. I think the things that were learnt certainly enabled us and our staff to look at where water is wasted.
90% of the water that we use on site is reclaimed water, and so that's since the birth of the Northern Water Plant. Water is our lifeline.
The Barwon Ministerial Advisory Committee is concerned about water in our area because we've got an increasing population and a decreasing supply of traditional water sources.
Water's extremely valuable to the town for not only residential uses but commercial uses. Also for our environmental, we've got some great rivers, lakes, creeks.
Water is almost invaluable to us. It's integral to growing food.
What we've seen over the last number of years is a significant decline against our 30-year averages in rainfall and inflows into our storages. We've made some significant investments in water infrastructure in our region, but now is the time for Barwon Water to lead us to the next discussion about water for our future.
The whole world, like everything revolves around water. Maybe if we lost it, then we wouldn't really have a world.
As a young teenager, I grew up in Narwarri on our family's hobby farm. Amongst the cows, we had ponies, we had chickens, we had pet rabbits. We had all sorts of things along the way, and I'm sure many of you can relate to that. And in fact, I was lucky enough to be a surrogate to an orphan Joey at one part in my teenage upbringing. And I have incredibly happy memories of those times, and I remember just how hard it was for my parents, both working full-time, to be able to afford their country lifestyle dream. And of course, when the drought hit, it became even harder, both from having to actually hand feed the animals both morning and night, but also financially by having to actually buy the keep for the animals and not actually having enough grass for us to be able to harvest our own stash of hay for feeding later in the year. But I will never ever forget the image of unbridled joy on my father's face as he danced in the rain in his underpants, soaked from head to toe as the drought actually broke. But what if the drought hadn't broken that day? Ladies and gents, my name is Jo Plummer, and today it is a very great privilege for us to be able to open this important conversation. Thank you to the G21 Alliance for allowing us to do that. Water for our future. Before doing so, I of course want to acknowledge the Wadawurrung people, the traditional owners of our land, and on our behalf pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and also to any of the other communities from Indigenous cultures that might be here today. And it is important to remind ourselves that we have an incredible privilege to be able to learn from the oldest living culture in the world. And certainly from Barwon Water's perspective, we stand with our Indigenous communities and we feel incredibly privileged to learn from them and share their knowledge and wisdom. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the leaders in the room, and that is probably just about everybody here today, whether you're from business, government, or indeed the community. And thank you for all of the hard work that each of you put into making our community a better place to live, work and play. I want to briefly introduce you, although we've done it very quickly. We know that we have Dr. Climate Scientist Ben, Dr. Climate Scientist, how do you like that as a new title?
I'll go with that.
Dr. Ben Henley, and then of course we've got Barwon Water Managing Director Tracey Slatter, and then we've of course got Kylie Cochrane, who is our Customer Engagement Expert Extraordinaire. And so if you think about the program insights, I'm no Jenny Brocky, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So work with us here. I'm going to start with Ben. Ben's passionate about teaching, researching, and also about the future of our world. I think we've all got a hand in that. He just happens to be a hydrologist as well as a climate scientist. Ben, can you tell us a little bit about your research, and in particular, how history can help us learn into and look to the future?
Okay, well, yes, can you hear me? So thanks for having me. I am trying not to be a quiet Australian. So I'm a scientist, and let me tell you a little bit about my work. So hopefully we have some slides coming up. So this is a swirling animation of something that we're talking about here, water in the atmosphere. This is not observations though, this is actually a model simulation, the very models that the IPCC uses to project climate change into the future. And what you can see is these big swirling patterns of, particularly in the Southern Ocean, these features that emerge. So we code up in thousands of lines of code the physics of the atmosphere, the chemistry, the biology, and put all of that into a model and say, what happens when that model changes? And this is the kind of beautiful thing that you get when you put all of that physics together. And there's nothing in that model that says, let's have a tropical cyclone in the North Atlantic or the Pacific, or let's have a big swirl coming across in the Southern Ocean. That's all coming from the key physics that we put into these models. And then we say, what happens when we change that system? So maybe we have, on long time scales, hundreds of thousands of years, orbital cycling, changes in the wobble of the Earth's orbit that we know about. We have some changes on 11-year cycles in the sun that we know about, and all of this goes into the model. We have large volcanoes that go off that put sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere and reflect some of the light for a short period of time, the incoming sunlight and solar radiation. We have changes in land use, changes in forests and what we call albedo, which is like the reflectivity of the surface. There's a whole bunch of other things. You've got the ozone hole, which people know about. There's contrails. There's the effect of clouds that actually emerge due to aircraft flying. Then there's biomass burning. There's fires that go on. And of course, the big one that we are all really concerned about, CO2 emissions from fossil fuel sources. Now, let me get to some more stuff. The CO2 in the atmosphere for the past 3 million years is shown here on this graph. Okay, can you see where today is? And can you get a sense of the scenarios that we are talking about at the IPCC? And we are going in that direction. Homo sapiens appeared in our anatomically modern Homo sapiens appeared at about 200 to 300,000 years ago. And we have ice core records that agree with sediment records going back 800,000 years, and we have sediment records going back millions of years. that show that the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are unprecedented in millions of years. And no human on Earth has experienced the CO2 in the atmosphere that we all have today. We are making really big changes to our atmosphere. Global temperature is increasing rapidly. This is a plot of global temperature. I was involved with this study. 2,000-year reconstruction of global temperature at annual timescale. There's a bit of a slightly warmer period, a slightly cooler period. This is the trajectory that we're heading in. This is global temperature. These are the changes that are occurring. Atmospheric CO2, a plot of atmospheric CO2 at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and global temperature. Now this is the big global picture, and we want to try to get to the local picture.
We do.
And I will just show this map, which is, if you look particularly at the middle one, these are the runoff. This is the water in the future. We're expecting a drier climate in Victoria. These are median projections of rainfall change for the next few decades. So with that, I'll...
Yeah, I think we've just found the smartest person in the room there. I don't know if you
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Definitely not.
That's really interesting, and you talk about the drier climate, and I guess what I'd like to ask you is around the dichotomy of we've just had the driest January on record, yet we've recently experienced some pretty decent rain. When is a drought, or do you think that that term is actually perhaps unhelpful and outdated nowadays?
It's a really good question.
Thank you.
The human experience is at times short term, and that's due to actually how we evolved as a species. We're really good at handling short-term risks, short-term impacts on our own little world, and we've only got so much skin. We can't measure the entire planet with our own skin and our own environment. So, of course, we have to look at in the long term. And as you would have seen in those the previous figures, with even annual temperature goes up and down from year to year, but that doesn't mean there isn't a long trajectory of change occurring into the future. And this drier climate that we expect into the future is already happening in Victoria. There's somewhat of a precedent that has been set in southwest WA, where we've seen rapid declines in inflows and really staggering pace of change there. So you could see that as a precedent for what may happen in Victoria.
Perhaps.
A change and drought is a short-term variation away from a mean state, but we're talking here about a trend, a change.
And so thinking about we're all either water users or water managers, what does that mean for us right here, right now?
Right here, right now, we're thinking about changes to the climate system. We're thinking about changes to our catchments. We need to continue to supply water to our civilization. We have a massively growing population, which everyone here knows about. What a beautiful region this is. I actually felt like moving down here.
Well, look, don't let us stop you. We'd love to have you.
But the region will face very much the same challenges that the whole of Southern Australia will face as these storm tracks that we know so important for our cool season inflows will start to shift south and already have, actually.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our next guest, who is not a stranger to many of us. Tracey's name is synonymous with leadership, and there is no question that both our people and our environment are better for having her as part of our quest to enable regional prosperity. So Tracey, we're here in Torquay, one of the most beautiful icons in our region, and we have many. We're very blessed. We're drinking some of the best water in the world, even if I do say so ourselves.
Yeah.
Nothing like a bit of self-adulation when you've got the microphone. Can you briefly share with us our system and where our water comes from?
Yeah, thanks, Jo. Our water is largely derived from the upper catchments of the rivers in the region. So to the north, the Moorabool system, which supplies a lot of the northern parts of Geelong. To the southwest, the Great Barwon River, which supplies where we are here today and right through to the southern suburbs of Geelong. The system really is a north-south system, with the Moorabool River being backed up by the Melbourne to Geelong pipeline, which, believe it or not, brings water from rivers in Gippsland to our region. And in the south, the Barwon River is backed up now by the Anglesey ball field, because we are remediating environment and improving the environment around the use of the Barwon Downs ball field in the late 90s and early 2000s. The southern part, where we are here today, is now only backed up by the Anglesea ball field, which we're working towards turning on, if needed, later this spring.
Okay, thank you. It's not as complex as it sounds, let me tell you. It's kind of, water in, water out, and it's quite disparate in terms of the geographic area, but yeah, that was a really good explanation. Climate change, obviously, which is a key topic of what we're talking about today, obviously has an impact on water security, both locally and globally. Talk about how this is and has affected our greater Barwon region.
Yeah, well, it was interesting listening to Ben and talking about what's to come. I think the scary thing is that it's already happened, where we have experienced, we model all of our inflows into our region, and with less rainfall, there's a multiplier effect with inflows into reservoirs and rivers. And we've already seen a 30% reduction in inflows into our West Barwon Reservoir, which is right up in the Otways. And these reductions are being experienced in all of our reservoirs across the region. In places like Perth, this step change that we're showing, there are 3 other step changes. They are now only getting 10% of their total water from rivers and reservoirs. So we're experiencing it. It's not just a short-term phenomenon. We've had other periods where there's been a few years of low rainfall, but we've never seen this new norm. And every water corp around Victoria plans their future based on post-1997 levels, and then stress tests it against things that will be most likely even worse.
30% is a big number. So thinking about that, and I guess thinking about Barwon Water's role, it's fair to say that these days we certainly think of ourselves more as an environmental business than what we ever have done in the past. But it's probably fair to say that we have contributed to, and in some ways still contribute to some of that, the climate change and how that's occurring. I'd like to provide a couple of comments on that.
Yeah, well, people might not be aware, but the water sector is one of the largest emitters of CO2 in the public sector, and Barwon Water is the second largest carbon emitter in the water sector, over 40,000 tonnes, not something that we're proud of. What we are proud of is our Strategy 2030, which has set some very bold targets for us to be zero emissions by 2030 and zero waste. And we're combining waste and emissions thinking with our commitment to affordable, secure water, and trying to think about how we can use our infrastructure to generate energy. Sewerage is very energy intensive to treat, but at the same time, it generates methane. We've got some trials in place in Colac to capture that methane. We're a long way down the track, and we'll hear about it later today, of turning that into energy, going back to industry, our own plants, but also other industries in Colac. And we do a lot of environmental work. We release environmental flows. We often do more than we're required to in terms of environmental flows into rivers. Very concerned about the impacts that less rainfall is having on our rivers and our environments.
It's an interesting conundrum when you're actually part of the problem yourself. And we are obviously hotter and drier, and there's a whole bunch of things and levers that we have in there. But of course, one of the other complexities is around population growth, and we heard that Geelong continues to be one of the fastest growing populations in the country, for that matter. So thinking about the resource, we're getting less of it, we're drier. Is there going to be enough to stretch across the population growth?
Well, we really can take some lessons out of what's happened over the last 50 years or so. Barwon Water sold more water in 1982 than we do now, despite nearly a doubling of the population during that time. And that gives us some real confidence that efficiency efforts in both industry and in residences make a difference. But what we are seeing over the last 10 years is a real kickback up the combination of population growth and the hotter, drier climate is leading to greater usage of water in total, in residential consumption in particular, and also more litres per person per day. And Barwon Water does a lot of long-term modelling. We do modelling on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a yearly basis, also on a 50-year basis. And when we look out and we see the combination of less supply of traditional sources of water from rainfall and rivers, so we see that reducing supply from that source, and we also see the increasing demand as population grows and as the hotter climate demands more water for the environment and for rivers, we know that we are going to have a major augmentation, an additional source of water for our region as early as 2029. And we will plan calmly with you for that. It is not a crisis, but it is important, and it'll be a big decision, because if we value our environment, we'll need to think of more diverse sources of water.
Great, thank you. Hold that thought. I do want to just explore the whole population growth a little bit further. And I'm going to call on Rose. So those who don't know Rose, she is obviously the Mayor of the Surf Coast Shire, and you have seen and felt your community grow exponentially over the years. Tell us, do you think that's a challenge or an opportunity from the perspective of water in growth?
Well, it's a bit of both. We've got a lot of challenges, and some we've tackled really well over the last couple of years, especially from the Millennium Drought, several years ago. But the opportunities ahead now is fantastic. We want to work with a great partnership with Barwon Water, and we've already done a lot of things to. Bruce Harwood from the Geelong Mayor talked about drought-proofing ovals and things, because our community really loves our sports. I mean, we're well ahead of what Geelong do anyway. So we've put big tanks, but we also now have recycled water to 4 or 5 of our major sporting grounds, because we know our community really need those grounds for our environment and to play sport. We've got thousands and thousands of people. But it's an opportunity too to have initiatives in technology. I think a lot of people used to laugh at governments where it was pouring rain, but you saw the sprinklers on. All our park rangers now have apps on their phones to actually turn off and on sprinklers when needed. So small things like that can put the best water at the best time. But it's always a challenge. But coming down from Mount Dunedin, we've got this fantastic Thomson Valley. And what we're trying to do with Barwon Water is, if we can get a pipeline, and instead of all that water going out into the ocean, bring it back in, because imagine having a food bowl on your around your suburbs as well. We've got a big strawberry farm already, but if we can imagine wineries coming in, because with wineries and a food base, it drives your economy as well. And we're a very progressive area, and we want to see these things done. But if we can have a partnership with Barwon Water with initiatives and challenges, but there is great opportunities.
You raised some really good points there, and not least of all, water for recreation and the environment. It's not just about the drinking water. And you also talked about the economics of it. And I'm going to just bring in Jennifer Cromitty is here. Where are you, Jennifer? So for those who don't know Jennifer, she is the CEO for Committee for Geelong. And obviously in her role is vary across large and small businesses across the region. Can you comment on, I guess, the dual challenges that we have in front of us in terms of water, population growth, et cetera, and what does that mean for business, and particularly our regional economy?
Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to comment. It's probably rather large issues that need to be grappled with, and my answer probably comes in a couple of ways. One is that from the Committee for Geelong perspective, we've had quite deep discussions with members, not just about the environment, but about the circular economy. So I'll probably take it slightly differently and say that we're looking at what we can do to respond to some government inquiries on this level. And I think from a business perspective, obviously businesses are looking at how they can reduce costs, but they're also really, I think, have a really strong social conscience as well. So I'll probably answer it in saying that we're going to put together some forums. We're already having discussions with Barwon Water, and we would love to be able to have this discussion with our Strategy and Policy Committee probably before the end of the year. But just to say that part of the issue, and I actually had a discussion with a member just yesterday, and the question that was put to me was about the role of Barwon Water and the role of the City of Greater Geelong in terms of stormwater. And how can we better use and access that stormwater and use it for a recycled use? And what could we do in terms of then talking to businesses who are interested in having a role to play in that conversation? So sort of an answer, but also a question, because it literally was something that just happened yesterday, and I said I would ask. So I just thought if I can put it back to you and say, and I don't know if the Mayor's still here, didn't Bruce Harwood leave? But it was something I just thought might be worthwhile having a discussion. And is there a role the committee can play in terms of maybe drawing together the opportunities to see if Barwon Water can extend their remit?
That's a hot topic, and it's a hot topic around the state. So yeah, good one to bring up. Thank you. Okay, so I'm now going to go up to, very carefully so I don't trip over, purposely wore pants today because it's certainly not unlikely to do something like that. But for our next expert panel, Kylie Cochrane. Kylie has over 25 years of experience in community engagement and stakeholder engagement, and she's actually the current international chair of the International Association for Public Participation. So thank you for coming along and sharing your time with us today. Can you tell us about the role of community and business and what role they might play in water resource planning for our community in the future?
Sure. I wanted to answer this by going back a little to give a bit more context, to talk about why community and business should be playing a role in talking about water planning and water policy. And I've got on the slide here, it says key engagement trends. They're actually social trends. And I'd like to quickly talk through these social trends because our society has changed substantially in the last decade. So very quickly, the first one, meaning is a critical social motivator. So I'm not just talking about the millennials. I'm talking about everyone in this room. We are here because this is meaningful to us, because it fits with our sense of purpose. It is important. And because there is so much noise in people's lives these days, you will only see them protest, react, make a complaint, or voice their opinion on